But there are like nuts and bolts parts of our economy that are not sexy and titillating, but holy cow, do they affect us on the most basic level, and they're just ignored.
Hello, welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on a guest who's been on before, and he knows a lot about energy, and we're going to talk about ESG, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is misnamed, but that's what they called it, and a lot more. And it's none other than Daniel Turner. Daniel, welcome to the Let People Prosper Show.
Oh, it's great to be on with you, Doctor. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah. It's really a pleasure to have you on. You were on a while back. We had a great conversation then, after we met, whenever we were testifying before the House Ways and Means Committee up on the Hill. And now it's a pleasure to have you back to talk about right before the election.
Yeah.
We're at 24 election. Can you believe it?
I know. And you know, there's an awful lot about the elections that bothers folks, and maybe for another podcast, there's a large conversation we need to have of the reason why the election is so important is because DC has so much power. And gosh, I wish DC just wasn't as powerful. Then the election wouldn't consume years of our life, right? But everything is all election all the time since 2023. So I'll be glad when it's done. Let's just put it that way.
Amen, brother. Amen. Well, but in case some audience has joined us since the last time you were on, or they forgot, let me go ahead and give them your bio, and then we'll jump right into it. So,
sure. I started. Oh, please, you want to give it? Please,
yeah, I was going to give it for you, unless you want to do it.
Go for it.
Let me read a little bit, and then you can add on whatever you'd like. Awesome. So Daniel Turner is the founder and executive director of Power the Future. For nearly 20 years, he has worked in communications and public affairs for several nonprofits and various campaigns, including his home district in New York for his uncle Bob Turner's successful and historic House race. Daniel started PTF to advocate for rural energy communities and the Power Center of Washington, D.C., which makes those policy decisions which impact energy workers. He's an expert in energy and environmental issues that pertain to jobs, rural communities, the U.S. economy, international affairs, and our national security. He's often on a lot of TV and radio and everything else, and he lives with his family on a working sheep farm in rural Virginia. So with all that, I mean, anything you want to add, go for it, Daniel. But I mean, you've got a great background. You've got a lot of stuff going on. What's been on your mind? What's been motivating you lately to do what you're doing?
Yeah, well, the election is all consuming, right?
Yeah.
As we just said, and energy has been front and center, even when it's not the main focus of the issue. Energy undergirds the economy, our national security. So you look at the ongoing and escalating war in the Middle East. Why does Iran have suddenly so much money? Energy policies, right? Energy sanctions that we've lifted on Iran, energy policies domestically that have caused oil prices to rise, which has definitely benefited Iran. So that's on my mind. The vice president, right? We don't know how the election's going to turn out, but she had a very clear energy and environmental record and positions. But then, suddenly she really wanted to win Pennsylvania, and she wanted to make inroads in Ohio. And so positions on things like fracking and EV mandates were total reversals. And no one ever asked her, right? And that's, why I'm happy to be on with you. I mean, we talk about, well, I no longer support a fracking ban. Well, I mean, it makes one question. Well, why did you ever support one? What is fracking, right? Why would you want to ban? What data did you see now that you no longer support a fracking ban? So energy's just been front and center of this entire election, whether they talk about it or not.
Yeah. And you're doing a great job on this. So if those of you who don't know about Daniel, I'll make sure to put a lot of stuff at this in the show notes page so you can check out all of this. And he's doing a lot of great work in the energy space. And as you know, Daniel, I mean, energy is kind of our master resource. So also part of our innovation and knowledge and everything else. That's also a big part of our master resource. But whenever you're thinking about physical things that we can touch, energy, oil and gas is in basically everything around us, whether these computers that we're talking through now, doing this video, or the clothes that we're wearing. I mean, sometimes they say, well, we need to stop fracking or we need to stop natural gas, like Kamala Harris has said in the past. But it's unfortunate because not only is this about jobs and the economy, which fuels the economy and everything that we have going on, but it's also about just our lifeblood, right? What is kind of your push and your work of why energy is so important to us?
Yeah, I started the organization because of rural energy communities. And when bad energy policies are made, they're the first ones affected by it. So just taking this current administration, day one, the canceling of the Keystone Pipeline, right? And that was 14,000 people who lost their job at the stroke of a pen. And there was a lot of indifference, right? There's a lot of John Kerry saying, well, we've given them the option now to find a job in the green economy. There's always a sense of callousness when it comes to oil, gas, or coal, or pipeline workers, or et cetera, that, we have an agenda. We're going to pass these new rules or regulations, and you all just have to cope. There are very few other sectors of the economy where we just come in with these huge sweeping pieces of regulation and say, hey, too bad for you guys, but you're just going to have to deal with it. So that's always been the focus of my work, are these energy workers who create a product that we all desperately need. Even if you believed the products they were producing were bad, right? Which I don't. Even if you said, it's climate change, we have to stop doing it. But the products that they bring to market affect us all, right? It's everything we grow and manufacture and transport and produce. And so we've seen and talked about inflation for the last couple of years. How come eggs are so expensive? How come? And there are multiple factors, no doubt. But the baseline price of energy has driven up prices on everything. And that makes all Americans suffer. So it just, again, like I said a couple times now, energy has been front and center, even if we're not talking about it.
Yep. And one of the things that we looked at in our hearing, our testimony that we gave at the House Ways and Means Committee, this has been a while now. It was like spring of 2023. But it's still around us. I mean, the stuff that we were saying then, it's interesting. I was going back here recently and reading my testimony and looking at some of the work that you did as well. And it's all came to fruition. It's one of those things where you can actually test your experiment and now it's coming true to where prices didn't go down. I mean, yes, we had inflation moderating, and they like to say inflation is down, but for the audience, right, it's still up 3% year over year, and that's over the 9% and plus that it was before. So prices are not down. Inflation has moderated, but we're still paying way more than we ever have before. And at the same time, there was this huge push to all these new EV vehicles and other things that are going on, and take away from Medicare. I mean, it's been a massive failure for what's been going on in the Inflation Reduction Act. But you, Daniel, have been looking at some of the projects and just the ridiculousness of some of this. And I know you have a paper that at the time when this will come out has already come out, but also I'll put that in the show notes page. But I wonder if you could share with us some of the idiocracy, if you will, of what's been going on with the Inflation Reduction Act and our taxpayer money.
Yeah, well, I will always have a special love for the Inflation Reduction Act. That's because I met you. So
that's right.
There's a little soft spot of
There we go.
But no, you're absolutely right. And it's funny to look back at what was a year and a half ago and say, all right, it's been bad these last couple of months, but it's going to get worse. And sure enough, it has gotten worse over the last couple of months. And there's really nothing to show for it other than expenses. So at the first presidential debate, Vice President Harris, at the end, when there was one question about climate change, she said, we've spent over $1 trillion to fight the climate crisis, as if that's something to be proud of, right? I don't know where the $1 trillion has gone. It's mostly been wasted. But you look at, one of the greatest examples of failure is Stellantis. Stellantis is a subdivision of Chrysler, which is owned by, I believe, a Belgian or German company. It's no longer an American auto manufacturer in its ownership. Stellantis received hundreds of millions of dollars from the Inflation Reduction Act to make these EVs in America. And I believe it was in early September, they announced they were closing their plants in Michigan. About 2,000 plus jobs were going to be closed, and they were moving operations to Mexico. And no one said, are you going to give the money back?
Right.
No one said, well, what was the purpose of this? They took the money and ran. And you can extend that to solar companies, to wind companies, to, the port strike that was all over the news in the beginning of October, end of September.
Yep.
The biggest industry hit by it, 40% was wind and solar, because those things are manufactured overseas. And so the Inflation Reduction Act, we're buying these products, but they're still made on foreign land. So what's the benefit of just spending? And if maybe I'm sure there's a Keynesian counterpoint to you who can say, like on the Let People Go Broke podcast, if we just spend enough, we'll spend our way into prosperity.
Right.
I haven't seen it yet. I don't think Milton Friedman ever did in his lifetime. And the Inflation Reduction Act is just further proof.
Amen. Yeah, I like that. The Go Broke podcast. Let people go broke. I don't like it, but that's a good one. One of the things that was interesting is you mentioned the $1 trillion, which they're all parroting now. But remember when it first came out, they said it was going to be like $300 and something billion is what they initially scored it as. And one of the things that we mentioned in our testimony was that this was going to be about 1.2 trillion, which has come out to be more along the lines of the reality compared to what they initially said. And so, this is one of the things, Daniel, that we oftentimes will take for granted what they initially tell us, but we've got to make sure we go back and look at all the details. One of the other things that comes up is all the jobs revisions. Each month they'll say, we have 250,000 jobs added. And then they'll come at it back and revise it down 90,000 jobs or something like that. But the media never reports on that part. They just report on the initial jobs that were released. And I think that's why, like you and I and others that are a part of this movement, we've got to hold the government, their feet to the fire, and it's got to be both sides, because both sides oftentimes will do this. But in particular, it's been really just apocryphal what we've seen from the Democrats in particular over the last couple of years, as they've tried to sell all the Americans that the economy is fine. Well, they tried to sell us that Biden was fine for a long time too, but I'll put that to the side for a minute. But, the policies and everything else. And I wonder, kind of what you're looking at right now, Daniel, is what are some of the big differences on energy policy that you see from the Biden-Harris, potentially Harris administration and then the Trump administration? What are some of the big differences that you find?
Yeah. And just really quickly on that thing you said about the numbers, it's so important that people are held accountable, because we have a lot of institutional crises in our country right now. We don't believe the American Medical Association. We don't believe the CDC. We don't believe. And so when a bureau like the Labor Department, whose job is just to be a boring numbers cruncher and be honest, when they come out and say, we have to revise down 820,000. I mean, that's not a revision. That's a manipulation. And that makes you no longer trust things. And that's bad for the nation when we can't trust our institutions.
Well put.
It's something I hope is changed if there is a Trump administration or even a Harris administration, that the people who come up with bogus numbers have to be held accountable. But when it comes to energy policy, something that I am concerned about, or that raises it makes me laugh. Let me just put it that way, is when Vice President Harris is celebrating oil production numbers. I thought oil was bad, but now they say oil is good. And she has said, and there's no doubt, we did hit a highest number of oil per barrel for a little while. Those have receded quite a bit, but they did of 13.3 or 13.4, I think, or 11.3, 11.4. I have to check. But then barrels per day hit an all-time high. But again, numbers can lie a little bit, because the oil that is produced now was first brought to the start, the drilling, the leasing, the movement of equipment and personnel. 6 years ago, 7 years ago, sometimes it's 10 years.
Right. That's a good point.
So Biden-Harris is celebrating, a record production number. But that all came about starting in 2018. Our leases now are at an all-time low. So that's why people say, how come energy prices haven't come down?
Yeah.
Well, the energy market isn't stupid, and it knows that leases are at an all-time low. So even though we're producing a lot now, 3, 4, 5, 6 years into the future, there's not a lot of optimism. And until that changes, prices are going to stay stubbornly high. It's a simple policy decision.
Hey, Daniel, let's stay with this for just a minute, because I've been wondering about this, and this is a great point that I haven't really heard a lot about. So, and you were right in your initial estimate. So right now we're about 13.2 million barrels per day.
Thank you.
So you were right initially there. And so that's as of July 2024, the latest numbers that are out, but it's probably still close to that amount. But, you know, I follow the oil and gas a lot too. You and I have talked about this before. That was my dissertation about oil and gas and the prices and everything and how they affect the economy. And still some of my academic work is in this space. And so I get asked sometimes about this exact point. Like, I thought Biden-Harris was against more oil production, yet oil production's reaching record highs. So does this seem like maybe they're doing something different? And my point has been, well, you know, the market figures out how to get around the regulations that they're being imposed. However, I had overlooked this point here that you're making about those leases taking years to get into place. Maybe would you mind expanding a little bit more on that?
Sure. Most of our oil comes from federal land. Unfortunately, most of our land is federal land, especially in the western states. Texas, of course, being the huge exception, which is why Texas's economy is prosperous and why people love to work in Texas. If you go to the Permian Basin, which is that imaginary line between New Mexico and Texas, I'll talk to oil and gas folks and they'll say on this side, in Texas, we get permitting in 8, 9, sometimes 10 days. Sometimes it's 3 weeks, but we get our permits. Other side, 2 years, 3 years, waiting. You know, they're 6 miles apart, but there's one is in New Mexico, federal land, Texas, private land. This is a very government cooperative industry, right? To start drilling for oil, there's a ton of government necessary relationships, right? You're moving equipment, you're drilling, you're digging, there's pipelines, government is part of the situation. We need government to cooperate with us. So when you have these enormous pieces of federal land that are by law available to oil and gas and production for leasing, those leasings are supposed to happen quarterly by law. Governor Burgum in North Dakota became a household name because he was the first governor to sue, saying, wait a second, those leases are supposed to happen. We're months delayed. You have to, by law, lease land so that oil and gas and others can have access to them to produce. That's how the states make their revenue. That's how people are employed. The Biden administration has just said no. We're not having leases in the Gulf. We're not having leases in the Atlantic, the Pacific. And if people say, well, of course you shouldn't have leases in the Pacific, go stand off the coast of California and look at all of the oil rigs in the distance. It's because there's oil there. Go walk along the beaches of Santa Barbara and see the bottoms of your feet with all the little black marks. There's no oil leak. There's just, it seeps from the ground because there's so much oil in the Pacific. But the Biden administration has just not allowed those leases to happen because of climate change. Wow. So what has happened is the leases that they got in the Trump administration, they're going gangbusters because industry does what it does. It produces. Yeah. So if you have a lease, you're going to try to exploit it as much as possible, as quickly as possible before it runs out. And that's why we have record production right now.
Wow. Yeah, man, great. That's great info there, Daniel. So but what you're saying though is that since they've slowed or not even given out nearly as many permits, we should be concerned about the next few years. When might that start to happen?
Well, if the Harris administration wins, we're in bad shape.
Okay.
If the Trump administration wins, I still think oil is going to remain stubbornly high for a while, but things could turn around by the end of 2025, beginning of 2026, right? Yeah. Industry wants to do its job. That's the thing that amazes me, and something that you and I would celebrate. Like if they're just allowed to produce oil and gas, they want to produce it in the fastest, most efficient, most profitable, That's what the Trump administration did, right? When they were allowed to operate. I always joke with folks, or when I do, Q&A or have conversations, all of these things that oil and gas is attacked for under the Biden administration, profiteering and price gouging, and how come they didn't say those things when Trump was president, right? Like, how come there was no profiteering or price? The oil companies refused to lower the price. Well, you'd think they would have done that when the big oil stooge was, but they didn't, right? Because when you have freedom, you try to produce more of something for the greatest number of people at the lowest price point. Yeah. So it will happen if Trump is elected, but it's still going to take a little time. This industry does not turn on like that. It can turn off like that. Yeah. But it does not turn on very quickly. And so it's going to take a while.
Yeah, great point. And it's interesting, too, because I think one thing that we'll probably see more of from a Harris administration compared to a Trump administration is a push to EV vehicles, away from gas-powered vehicles. I mean, and that's going to be highly disruptive across the economy. And I mean, not just, the people who I think, Daniel, who are going to get hurt the most, and what I've seen from some of the research, are really going to be the lower income Americans who won't be able to afford these electric vehicles, and the electricity prices that will probably necessarily skyrocket, as Obama once said, because of the additional demand for electricity across the country. Don't you think that's also a major concern?
Yeah. Oh, it's a huge concern. Okay. Now, we don't know where Vice President Harris stands on EV mandates because she's changed her position on that as well.
That's true.
Of course, I don't necessarily believe her. Yeah. She wants to win an election. But this push of the Biden administration that right now, by executive order, by the year 2030, half of all car sales have to be EV. Now, you're a brilliant economist. You can explain this better than I can. But if that is the rule and no one changes it and we get to 2030, so then what happens? If I'm a dealer and I have to say I'm going to sell 30 cars this month, 15 combustion, 15 EV, the 16th combustion I'm not allowed to sell, right? What do I do by law if this is the rule, right? If you are General Motors and you say we sell roughly 17.5 million cars a year. So General Motors now can only sell this many. And if I want a Buick, nope, you can't. You can buy an EV or nothing until we hit parity. Wow. And then you can buy one, then you can buy one, then you can buy. How does that work?
Man,
right?
Central planning never works.
Exactly. And that should scare the crap out of people. Yeah. Right. Like now, you know what it does? I think it encourages now black markets.
Yeah.
Now you go to your brother-in-law who's got a friend who has a Ford dealer and he sells you one off book and you probably have to pay $5,000 more because he's got to cover things. But that's how I'm going to buy my car now. I'm going to buy things in black markets because I need a car and I cannot legally buy one unless I buy the one that the president wants.
Wow.
These are great conversations if we had real conversations, but we don't. We talk about transgender and we make fun of, and those are all important. I'm not saying they're not important.
Yeah.
But there are like nuts and bolts parts of our economy that are not sexy and titillating but holy cow, do they affect us on the most basic level? And they're just ignored. They're ignored by media. And we talk about, do you swear a abortion ban and all important issues? Don't get me wrong. But holy cow, these issues are really important too, and they're just glossed over.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, one of the things that I highlight often, Daniel, is about the budget and spending and the national debt and what all that's influencing us and things like the Inflation Reduction Act and how it's influencing us over time. Because for a long time, we didn't have much inflation, and we didn't have higher interest rates. But now we've seen what the effects of those types of policies can have of higher inflation, higher interest rates, and everything else. So I always try to connect those things. But even today, I haven't heard too much about the excessive spending really from the Harris camp or the Trump camp. I think I'm hopeful that maybe the Trump camp will get it better in line than what the Harris administration could do. But it's going to be interesting. And this is another big one, though, on the energy front, is if we get our energy policy wrong, we're going to have hell to pay for the future, because it does influence us. And one thing about it, Daniel, is that we have examples to look at. We can look at Germany and see what they've done over time by moving to this green energy agenda, to where basically they're heating homes now with wood and causing more particulate matter within the homes that are more costly for people than the natural gas and the cleaner ways that we have it here. And so you're exactly right. The unintended consequences of these actions are going to continue to be huge. What are some of the other, kind of unintended consequences or things that you've been looking at recently?
Well, this is something that I struggle with, and again, you're a brilliant economist, and maybe you can guide me. But there's a lot of things I'm wrestling with.
Sure.
Microsoft made the announcement that they were going to buy Reactor 2 at 3 Mile Island. If everyone remembers, 1979, 3 Mile Island Reactor 2 had an incident. We'll call it a meltdown, completely contained. Nothing bad happened. No one got sick. No radiation leak. But it's been shut down ever since. Microsoft and Reactor 1 has continued to power this part of Pennsylvania. I think it even maybe goes into some part of Jersey, 3 Mile Island. But Reactor 2, now Microsoft has made a deal that they're going to clean it up, retrofit it, start it again, and they want to build a data center, and they're going to use Reactor 2 for the data center. And everyone says, great. In theory, great. But a question I'm struggling with, and I love the free market. Yeah. If the people of Pennsylvania wanted cheap electricity, would there have been the move to open Reactor 2 just to produce more electricity to lower costs? But if a multi-hundred trillion billion dollar tech firm wants it, and that's the direction we're headed. Bill Gates has been pushing data centers linked with micronuke. I think that's understandable. They need a ton of electricity. Goldman Sachs says we need about 160% increase in electricity production for all of the data centers and AI. But when you have these quasi-government entities, what if you just wanted to build micronukes or expand the natural gas plants just to produce more electricity so that costs are lowered for all businesses and for all consumers? So I'm a little concerned about this idea that oligarchy has almost seemed to taking over our electric grid. If you have money and you're powerful and you have DC lobbyists, you can build a micronuke. But if you're just a rural person in Nebraska and your electricity is high, you're not getting a micronuke. So I'm struggling there. I love the free market, Vince, I do. Sure. But I'm struggling with this idea that the rich will be able to build themselves electricity and the Americans can't, right? Yeah. Help me. No, it's a great conundrum, because in Texas right now, we're facing this as well. There's this discussion about we're going to need a lot more generation of electricity over the next, I think they said next 10 years. And half of that generation is going to be more about the mining centers, data centers. And so the AI revolution and everything that's happening right now, which I think there are a lot of benefits, are certainly going to have some hiccups, some roadblocks along the way. Some road bumps, I should say. And so this is going to bring up some interesting policy questions. I mean, from the free market perspective, my thought is to try to figure out what government impediments, regulations are in the way. Like, why is it that from 3 Mile Island and that nuclear reactor 2 was able to be purchased by or be able to be used by Microsoft, but couldn't have been used in the private market before then? Like, you know what I mean? Like, if we can remove some of those barriers, I think the market would be able to have more abundant energy. And so that way, if Microsoft wants to use it some, well, great, but we're also going to have it available for the community as well. So maybe there's something else we need to look at there. And I don't know all the ins and outs of that part of it. Sure. Yeah. And that's just this newfound need for electricity because of data mining and AI. And look, every time you grab your phone and you say like, hey, Alexa, hey, Siri, whatever, and you ask a question, right? Tons of electricity is being used, and people are like, well, it's the phone. It's like, no, the phone's talking in nanoseconds to a data center that is finding you that address, that phone number, that data. You know, who was the last pitcher to throw a no-hitter in the World Series, right? Every time you ask a question, so much electricity, and that electricity need is going to explode. Like I said, 160% increase according to Goldman Sachs, 160% increase in the need for electricity production. But there are just parts of America that need more reliable and affordable electricity. And I almost liken it to, as I mentioned earlier, this is an industry that requires government cooperation, energy.
Yeah.
Refining. We would love to open more refiners, but refining we haven't opened a refiner in America in 50 some odd years. What if Uber said, hey, we're going to open a refinery because we want to refine more crude to produce gas for our fleet of cars. And we just want to do it faster and cheaper. And the government was like, boom, go for it. And now Uber is paying, $1.75 a gallon because they have their own refinery. But what I want to pay $1 was, well, no, you can't. You're not Uber. And that's kind of where we're at. Yeah. That's what scares me a little bit. That's like if you have power to lobby to get energy in the private hands, in the hands of your company, but this is where government is now picking who gets cheap energy. And I don't like that direction.
No. Yeah, I don't either. I mean, you're picking winners and losers, and you're likely to pick the wrong ones, right? Government does not do a good job of picking the winners, and so we often get a lot of losers, and ultimately the taxpayer pays for this as well. To your point about those rural communities and everything else, they're going to have the burden shifted on them to not have the amount of power, and so they might actually have more blackouts and other things over time, which is unfortunate, along with paying out more in taxes and fees and other things. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and Daniel, I think that the nuclear really should be a big part of the future with natural gas, nuclear, and maybe there's some wind and solar. Like in my free market mind, I want the market to work, but I want there to be a level playing field. I don't want there to be production tax credits. I don't want there to be IRA subsidies and even subsidies before that. And states shouldn't be picking winners and losers. In Texas, we had these Chapter 313 property tax abatements that primarily went to wind and solar. Why are they getting a benefit over others? And what's also bothering me a lot lately is, in Texas, we started this Texas Energy Fund where they put $5 billion into it for low interest loans, and maybe even some grants that will come out of it. But for banks to then finance natural gas projects. And so they're like, well, we can't do anything about these federal sides, so we're going to go after it with state subsidies and propping it up, which I get it to a certain extent because they're trying to level the playing field. But my push has been lately is like, okay, the state could also reduce severance taxes. Severance taxes in Texas and a lot of other oil and gas states fund like the rainy day funds and things of that nature. Why are we putting the burden of a rainy day fund on oil and gas, yet we're propping up wind and solar at the same time? So I think at the state level, there's also a lot that we could be doing to level the playing field and removing as many barriers and regulations as we can, even as the federal government, especially under the Biden-Harris, and if there is a Harris administration, are likely to keep us from going in that direction. But what do you think about some of what the states are doing or could be doing?
It's such a great point, and this is the danger of the Inflation Reduction Act, and why we testified about it with such clarity, I think, is because you've got this enormous amount of federal government money, which is screwing things up in the state. And the most conservative states' rights Republican governor is not going to turn away free federal money. They're just not. And that's just, and I think the Biden administration and when Schumer and Pelosi crafted this at the end of 2022, they remember this thing passed with the last couple of days left of the Congress before McCarthy became speaker. And I think that's why they crafted it with so much money at stake, because they knew they could just screw up states. They could give away free money and these free subsidies. And now you've got states problems. And so you take a great state like Texas and people are going to then blast the governor. How are you not taking all the free money? New Mexico got $400 million. How come we didn't get any? You turned it down. Now he's got an election problem, right? So the best thing the states could do, if possible, is eschew federal money. But tough. That's a tough ask, right? That's a tough ask. You see great Republican governors, great in theory, Republican governors who are taking this money, they're buying land, building wind farms, and then they're selling it to the neighbor state. And you say, so what's the benefit of our state? What are we getting out of this, right? We've given up our land, we've built these transmission lines, all the money came from DC, and now another state is getting supposedly more reliable energy. What? I didn't know we were for sale, right? I didn't know And you see states like Utah doing this to California.
Yeah.
And it's creating tension, right? Why are we giving our power to California? Because Gavin Newsom is running such a terrible state that he's desperate for power, so he'll buy it from us. But what about the people of Utah? So there's a lot of state on state rivalry happening, and it's all because the government is dropping in so much money and creating this deliberate warfare amongst the states.
Yep. Yeah, it's wild too, Daniel, because, you hear a lot about, well, it's market failure. If the markets were working correctly from their view, from the left's view in particular, we would have more wind and solar. We would be dealing with climate change because that's the crisis in their mind. And in our last episode, you and I talked about the problems with the climate change. Like first it was global warming, then that wasn't happening anymore. So they had to switch it to climate change and everything else. And so, if you take their assumptions and everything else, maybe you could make a case for where they're at. But the problem is their assumptions break down when you look at facts, and the science that's here.
Yeah, their assumptions break down and their solutions break down because everything we're proposing, you mentioned Germany earlier and Europe earlier, everything we're proposing, Europe has been doing for 20 years longer. It's one of the few things that Europe is way ahead of America on, right? They're normally a little slower on certain things, but Europe is a good 20, 25 years ahead of us on all things green. The British Parliament back in September announced a guaranteed 10% increase in utility bills for the consumer in 2025, but they said that they will cap electricity at 28.5, I believe it was 28.5 euro cents per kilowatt hour.
Wow.
In America, we used to pay 11 cents. It's now 17 cents. So it's gone up quite a bit. And that was the average. Certain places always paid more or less, but it's gone up considerably nationwide. But still 17 cents compared to 28 cents. How expensive is electricity in England? Why? England just announced they were very proud to close their last coal mine, right?
Wow.
They have a complete ban on fracking. They're putting all their money into offshore wind, or they're waiting for Vladimir Putin to produce, to deliver natural gas, but he's got sanctions. So Putin's selling it to the Indians, who are selling it to the French, who are selling it to the English. So you're getting all those markups.
Wow.
So we look at what we're doing and we're like, other countries have done this and nowhere has it worked. So why are we following suit?
Man, insanity, Daniel, right? Insanity.
I used to have a full head of hair before I did this job. I joke about it all the time. It's just pure insanity. And the thing I took away most from our hearing is you would say these things, you say them much better than I do, but there's really no argument. And you would look and there would be the member of Congress and they would be reading off their notes and then they'd wag their finger at you and read off their notes and then they'd get up and leave the room. And you'd say, well, that was a waste of time. Like, Congressman, you didn't hear a word I said. And you're making policy, right? You're making policy. It's very frustrating.
It is. Well, the last thing, and then we'll wrap up here, is kind of going through that's affecting a lot of states now, and energy policy and everything else is this whole ESG, environmental, social governance, and it's been like a plague going through the country. And I've been writing more about this, and and I've talked to other people about this too, like Jason Isaac and Paul Tice and others, who have done a lot of work in this space, as you have. And, initially, whenever I first heard about ESG, I was kind of like, well, let the markets work, because I think at the end of the day, this ESG is not going to bring about the returns. And so they'll move away from it over time. But the problem with my thinking, it was my assumptions were wrong, is that government is infiltrating our financial sector through their regulatory policy to push ESG through the SEC, different areas throughout the economy. And then the states, the big banks like BlackRock, State Street, and others were going in and using the public pensions and municipal debt to say, we're going to have funds that are going to push us towards ESG that were not doing their fiduciary duty to the pensioners or the taxpayers. And so that's really where I started getting upset. I was like, no, this ain't right if you're having the government do this. Now, if the private sector wants to do it, I don't like it. But I do think they're going to get worse returns over time. And so that's where a little bit of my free market is like, well, I don't want to ban it necessarily for everyone. But I think when we look at what the states are doing and the federal government, we've got to get this out of the policy realm and have people do it on their own accord versus government. But what have you been looking at and thinking about with ESG, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a poison on the energy industry because it hits financing, it hits regulation, and the fact that the government is going to treat you as a company differently than your competitor if you have a better ESG score, however they're measuring that. It's how much philanthropy you're giving to environmental causes, how much diversity you have in your board makeup, right? Mm-hmm. So the regulatory action of the government, and I've said this a couple of times now, this is an industry that requires government cooperation. But if government is going to treat me differently than my competitor in the regulatory space because they like my ESG score, which is totally arbitrary, well, then you have just chaos in the marketplace. And that's all we have is complete and total chaos in the marketplace. Riley Moore was the treasurer of the state of West Virginia. He's running for Congress. He'll likely win, in a couple of days or an election because he is from a very red district, but he was the state treasurer and he was the first one to pull all of the state's pension funds out of BlackRock to say, your job is to make this pension fund money. It is not to choose funds based upon your, again, understanding of these credit scores. And on the flip side, if you had invested in all of these green techs and green technologies, your pension fund would be broke. Green funds have performed poorly under, which is so bizarre. Again, another podcast. If you could walk me through this one, I bought some green stock as soon as Biden was elected, thinking, well, I know they're going to have to do this, this, and this to push their green. These things are going to go through the roof. Got buried. Absolutely buried. Yeah. The amount of money they've dumped into these companies or this industry. So if you put the pension fund in the green technology, you have underperformed significantly the Dow. So ESG it's just been chaos. Yeah.
Yeah, it really has. And there have been a couple of other studies that have come out, like in Oklahoma. They talked about the fees were higher, the interest rates, the cost of these municipal debt was higher because they say that you reduce the number of banks who can compete in the marketplace to provide it. So it was raising those costs. And there was another one in Texas too. And I basically helped debunk both of those because what you looked at was also a period of time whenever we had rising interest rates. And they tried to correct for that some, but there were interest rates across the economy. It wasn't just the federal funds rate. It was also the 10-year treasury note rate and other things. And you also have to look at the risk versus reward in these certain bonds. And so at the end of the day, they were pushing research with a lot of technical modeling and everything else to try to say that these were a cost of removing these banks out who were practicing ESG, but it was because they were trying to push the green energy agenda and not actual economics behind what was sound economics is what I would argue behind what was going on in those marketplaces. And so there were explanations for this that wasn't because of that and the ESG banning of these public pensions and municipal debt. It was because of the marketplace in general and the risk tolerance that was out there.
Yeah, exactly. I go back to an old interview from the great Milton Friedman, and I forget where it was when he was asked about corporate philanthropy. And his response was, the best corporate philanthropy is to run the most efficient company, period, right? They shouldn't have philanthropy. And I know that outrages people. And they're like, of course, Bank of America should be giving. No, they shouldn't. Because if Bank of America has $10 million to give to its beloved causes, well, that $10 million came from you, right? Like I wish you didn't have 10 million surplus budget and you lowered all of our fees a certain percentage. Sure. And that's the best philanthropy you can do, is run the most profitable business for the best, for the value of your customers. And so, the ESG, you dump this on the energy industry and they wonder why energy is so expensive. If I have to play all these little loopholes and hire these consultants and go through all this charade to appease government regulators, well, that fee is going to get tacked on somewhere. And that just creates chaos. And again, why is egg so expensive? Why is milk so expensive? Why? It's just pure chaos. And that's my concern of the Harris administration. If she's able to, if she wins, if she squeaks out a win, is philosophy of ideology coupled with power is dangerous. and she has this very rampant ideology, but she has the power to enact it. And we've seen the last couple of years, it's just been economic chaos. It's been world peace chaos, right? But it's been economic chaos. And Americans can't. Tim Waltz said it best. Americans can't afford 4 more years of this. I agree wholeheartedly.
That's exactly right. Yep. Well, man, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, Daniel. We could go on for a lot longer. I'll have you back on soon. That'll be fun. And where's the best place for people to find you and your information and all the things that you're sharing?
I appreciate it. It's great to be on with you, Doctor. Daniel Turner, PTF on most of my platforms, especially Twitter, or powerthefuture.com. And it's great to be on with you and good to see you again. Thank you.
Yeah, you too, Daniel. And God bless you and your family. And
thank you.
Keep doing the great work that you're doing. And I'll make sure to put all this in the show notes page as well. So thanks. Daniel. And for the audience, I hope you enjoy this discussion. Please go out and give us a 5-star rating and share this with your friends and family. Energy is important. It's one of the master resources of our economy, and I hope that you've learned something here today. God bless you, and let people prosper.